slides, just to give you the ideas, because we aren't going to have time to actually practice them with the 40 minutes we have left. So you might want to jot some notes to yourself about how you could use them. But where we're picking up now, we're on slide 21, we're on page 3 of your handout. This is addressing that. Remember, we talked about what will make learners successful, and one of the ways is working with a variety of partners. So always thinking about how do I get the kids to change partners and not just work with the person next to them, or it'll take longer to get them into partners than I want to. So this is taking the map of the Arab world and giving each student a copy, and then modeling a conversation that they could have and say, can we meet in Morocco? Can we meet in Egypt? Can we meet in Tunisia? And when they're holding their map, imagine that you're looking at them and going, okay, let's see, Morocco. Oh, I don't have anybody that I'm meeting in Morocco, so I write your name on my map by Morocco, that line. I think the line isn't there for Morocco right now. Anyway, I draw a line and put Morocco, I'm meeting name in Morocco. And she writes, I'm meeting Donna in Morocco. And then we go on to the next person and say, can we meet in Egypt? You look at my map and go, oh, I don't have anybody that I'm meeting in Egypt, so I write your name on my map to say I'm going to meet you in Egypt, and you write my name on the map. So it's like a dance card, if you think of that, until I get all those places filled, and then we go back to our seats, and if we have some people who still have some openings, we check with everyone to see if there's someone else who's looking for a partner in Tunisia or Morocco or whatever, and write those names down. Inside of the notebook, they take that map inside their notebook that they carry with them to class every day. And then, when they come to class, I could set up an activity where they're going to work for that day with their partner from Egypt. And so they look at their map that they have and see who their partner is, and go find that person, and that's who they're working with for that class period or for that week. And if that person is absent, then they get to find someone else who has a partner absent, or they have a group of 3. It's just to have an organized way for them to work with different people. And the other hope that I have is if they look at that map frequently to find who their partner is going to be, that they finally get in their minds where all those countries are located. Little geography lesson with every single activity that we do, so that they're starting to make that connection, starting to connect the Arabic script to that country shape, and can then easily find each other. I did this with the French-speaking world, and I changed the map every quarter so that they could find more partners to work with. It also served the purpose of giving the kids some choice as to who they were going to work with, but not random, wide open all the time. So they could go around. Plus, they were practicing a conversation dialogue. Can we meet here? Can we meet there? Etc. So that's getting into that variety of partners to help them move quickly to a new person instead of just your shoulder partner, or find a partner. And when you say find a partner, they always find the person that they are most comfortable with. So, quick idea for that. Familiarity, when, again, we think purposeful communication. Lots of activities like this, but think about it as a way for the kids to get to know each other better. With things like likes and dislikes, leisure activities. This is a grid that you could set up. The top one set up in the Arabic language with the visuals to help the kids understand that. Names of the students, and then ask them, do you like cheese, do you like eggs, do you like pizza, what if you're working on a unit on food, and find out more about each other. So they get done with that activity where they interviewed each other and found out who likes this, that, or the other thing. But again, so what do you do with that? You just say, okay, we're done. No, now we have to work in groups. We have to tabulate our results. Then we have to create a class profile of likes and dislikes, or whatever that topic might be that we used on that. We can put that up on a wall in our classroom so that, again, it's another way to get to know each other. It's purposeful because we're getting to have a more complete profile of who we are. And perhaps we use a lot of these different categories. It could be about food preferences, it could be about leisure activities, classes, talents, whatever those are. But maybe we're gonna use that then so that we can connect with another classroom and see if we're very similar or not in how our likes and dislikes, or the classes we're taking, or whatever it is. An opportunity to communicate beyond the comfort of our classroom, and that's a huge plus to what interpersonal is about. You know, ultimately we want them to talk to those native speakers, and ultimately in the countries that speak those languages, but they've got to start somewhere. They start in the classroom, but maybe then the next step is, if you have more than one class, to have them work on those kinds of surveys, but then to compare with the classroom next door and see where the similarities and differences are. Maybe it's talking to someone who came to this workshop today and say, okay, we can connect via Skype with our classrooms. We're each gonna do the same survey, and then we're gonna have the kids talk to each other about similarities and differences. Purposeful use of finding out what those categories are with someone else, and keep bumping out. So it's another classroom, maybe in your school, another classroom in Washington, D.C., then a classroom all the way across the country that you're trying to find out similarities and differences through the language, and then ultimately to the places where the target language is spoken. So, purposeful use of language. Questions. This is the hierarchy that the oral proficiency experts use to see how far can you go with your language. And so giving the kids this kind of a ladder that they can refer to so that they become better at asking more interesting questions. The research tells us that we as teachers and people in general spend an awful lot of time asking yes or no questions. It's where we spend our life. And so how do we get beyond that? We have to practice so that we're not automatically just doing yes or no questions. So this is the hierarchy. You can do this with English if the kids need it, along with then the Arabic, so that they can think of the different words and keep building the kinds of questions that they can ask to have a more interesting conversation. Remember when we looked at those descriptors as they went across, it said that they had to be able to ask a variety of questions, they had to be able to use follow-up questions, etc. So this is a way to work at that and get more, a richer response from the students. Because what, when, where, and who can be answered with short single-word answers many times. Why and how requires a little longer. Yeah. Good question. Any other? Okay. Interpersonal is that negotiation of meaning. The phrase negotiation of meaning is defined here as a process that speakers go through to reach a clear understanding of each other and to keep the conversation going. And for our students, I think it's almost starts with keeping the conversation going and then adding to that, getting a clearer understanding of what you mean. Because that's expecting them to use more language and explain themselves in more detail. So it's, I think, a little harder than just keeping the conversation going. But we have to, when ACTFL came out and evaluated teachers across the United States about how successfully we were teaching the interpersonal, one of the things they noted in classrooms across the country was that we were modeling question, answer, done. You know, you think of how you start class and how you ask a student a question, you get an answer, then you go to the next student, then you go to the next student. I said that's really not very good modeling. You need to keep that going, and so modeling with that student, that back and forth, how do you ask a follow-up react to it, and then have the kids work with each other to model what you just modeled for them, is going to build the kids' interpersonal communication skills. So, one of the ways to also think about that negotiation of meaning is when they don't understand, how do you get more information from the students to get them to say more in the language and not just to fall into English. So I'll give you just a quick minute to look at these two boxes here. Strategies that learners can use when they don't understand, and strategies learners can use when they're not understood. Okay. So have you planted with your students those expressions that they can use when they don't understand what's going on? So that they can ask you in Arabic, I don't understand, slow down, repeat, show me, etc. What are the other phrases you teach your students so that they can be successful that way? And then when they're not understood, what can they do with their partners so that they don't just tell them what the word is, but they try to describe for them what is confusing for their partner. I'm just going to give you about a minute to brainstorm with the people around you. What kinds of things do you do? What kinds of expressions do you teach?
Would you say that again?
ما فهمنا كيف هو يقول لنا لا هو طالب الشعر طالب الحين قال جملة وانت ما فهمت عليه ايش عمل الطالب؟ بس كيف يقول لك انا اعيدها؟ انت كذا توقف طالع فيه هو يظل يعيدها لا هو طالب كيف يقول لك كيف يوضح اللي قاله كيف يعيدها مثلا الطالب قال جملة وانا طالع عليه الطالب يقول لي لحظة وعيدها مرة ثانية انا اعرف الطالب هو عرف ان انا ما فهمت عليه وهو الان يحاول يعيد فانا اقول له لحظة عشان انا اعرف نفسي انا راح اعيد
Hopefully, we heard some really good expressions over here where I was sitting. Hopefully those are expressions you're teaching the kids, you're modeling for the kids, that even if you don't need to ask for repetition, that you are asking the students as you're being that strong leader in the front of the classroom, that you're asking someone to repeat, you're asking someone to explain, etc. So they start hearing those same phrases over and over again. Here are some ideas. Are those some of the things that you asked? And think about that. Are the kids able to refer to these expressions in Arabic? Or are they going to need those expressions in Arabic then with some English underneath or a picture underneath? to help the students understand what the Arabic is. We always want to stay in the target language all of the time, and we can stay successfully in the target language all of the time. Getting the kids to understand that target language, if this is a strategy to help them stay in the target language, maybe it's useful for them to have both the English and the Arabic there to give them some of those most often used ways of asking for clarification. This is a negotiation of meaning, but it comes under the category that ACTFL has added to what we should be thinking about when we assess our students, and it's the category of clarification. When students don't understand, if we really want them to stay in the target language, have we taught them phrases and expressions to use so that they can stay in the target language, and ways that they can find their way through to not have to resort to English? So you notice that the last one that's up there, parenthetically, is when they fall into English, because they just don't have any other way of doing it. It's a reality, but it's at the bottom of the list. And it should be a last resort, because if you talk to someone who doesn't understand English, that's really not gonna help. So working with the students, constantly giving them those strategies over and over again. I used to put those up on the wall in my classroom. I also put them on their desktops and taped it down so that they could be looking, and I could walk around and I could be pointing to expressions they could use. I tried to make the list a little bit shorter to be easier for them to see quickly, and some of the more useful expressions that I felt would help them stay in the target language as they were going. So it's another strategy. What you're doing is you're equipping the kids with the language that they need, instead of the way I used to teach, which was always thinking of the theme I was working on if I was talking about school, and thinking of all the single words that went with it. Just as important, and perhaps a little more important, are the clarification words that we need to give them right away from the beginning, so that they think automatically to ask for help when they don't know the word. We're going to talk about some sample tasks. In the interpersonal, remember purposeful, meaningful. So on the left-hand side, you have students, if you were working on a unit about clothing or whatever, describe to your partner what you're wearing. Very exciting. Okay, I'm looking at you and I'm telling you what I'm wearing, and you're looking at me. Better if you can put it in a context that's purposeful. Look at this invitation. You and your partner need to figure out what you should wear. More meaningful. Okay, so they're still working with clothing, but now it's a bit more interesting than just saying, look at me and tell me what I'm wearing. Oh, exciting. Okay. Do you have to drop down to that very basic level at the very beginning? Maybe, but that's not where you want to spend your time. Maybe you need to just get that vocabulary in their head in a variety of ways. But where you want to move to right away is a meaningful, purposeful situation where they can use the language and it makes sense.
Do you think as an intermediate novice, they can read this font?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I did an
Quite frankly.
second year.
This is
and
only a
I used
sample
it
for what you
to
can do.
Right. You know, you can certainly simplify it. Look at a children's invitation. I couldn't find one.
Yeah.
My limited ability to understand written Arabic.
I thought you used it.
Yeah.
I thought you used the same one.
I use the strategy with French.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
Translate it to
and
Arabic.
another way you can do it is like introduce culture in order
Right.
to raise a question.
Yes.
They can show them a wedding picture,
Right.
Yeah.
which is different
Right.
than an
Right.
American or whatever
Right.
wedding.
Right.
So from that picture, you can.
What would you wear?
What would you wear?
Exactly.
So that way you connected
Yeah.
the aspects of culture and language in
Exactly. That's a great suggestion there to avoid that Arabic script too hard. Thank you for sharing that.
This
We talked about that circumlocution again when ACTFL says 90% plus target language. They're not just talking about you, the teacher, they're talking about the kids. And so helping them figure out how they can describe something that they see when they don't have all the words that they need. So can they restate it in simpler words? I mean, and very simply, and this is when I think looking at this picture, I could start with just saying rice, or food, or it's supper, or whatever. That's how simple you could get for that novice beginner to, instead of them saying, I don't know how to say that, I don't even know what it is. I can't do that. Okay? You're trying to always tell them, what would you do? You know, if you had to tell someone, what would you say? Could you give a category? Could you give a description? Could you give a definition? Turn to your person sitting next to you and look at those last three: category, description, definition. What would you do to describe that image that you see there? Again, just 30 seconds.
I have no idea. Whatever
سويا
شعرية
احنا نسميها سويا
مغربي
شعرية يقول هي ياكل السكر ايوه السويا
مغربي
Okay. These kinds of activities are great. Bell ringers, performance, to have an image up on the screen and have kids come in and start telling each other as much as they can. What could they say if they don't know that word? Again, it's, you know, it's partially dependent on what's the unit that you're working on, so that they have some vocabulary to work with or whatever. But it's also forcing the kids to say what they can say in the language and different ways that they could express it. And to get everybody engaged, a lot of times, and I know this becomes the challenge for you working with the Arabic script too, is for me with my French students is I would have them brainstorm as many things as they could write down about what they saw there, just so that they were engaged instead of just waiting for the next activity. So however you can do that, maybe it's drawing related things, if they aren't working with the script yet. Really important activity that you can do frequently with the students to help build their imagination and creativity to describe things that they might not have the exact word for. Comparing similarities and differences, you know, that it seems to be a favorite topic for French teachers, at least, is to do houses. And it's interesting, but you know, it's also challenging for the students. And so thinking about the houses that they typically live in, this is Appleton, Wisconsin, if you ever get there on the left-hand side. Looking for similarities and differences, and what can you say instead of just describe that house, describe the house you live in. Bringing in that cultural piece of comparing it to a place from the Arabic-speaking world, and what do you see? And could start very simply with even shapes and colors, and big and small, and pretty and ugly, whatever you want. One of my colleagues from the University of Minnesota, Elaine Cherone, did research on what will make kids say more when they're learning another language. And she said her profound finding was, after all of her research and listening to kids all over, all different ages, was 2 pictures are better than 1. Think about that. You just show them 1 picture, okay, I can say something, and maybe you start with 1 picture, But what happens when you show a second picture? Now you start looking back and forth and saying what's the same, what's different, and you have more things to say. And so that was, was again one of those things where you go, well, of course. If they have something they compare and look at, then they start going back and forth and saying, you could start simply by counting how many windows do you see, how many doors, how many floors, all of those different things that you can do. 2 pictures, and for anything, not just houses, work better than one, so that they're constantly looking back and forth and making those comparisons to get more interpersonal practice. At the basic level, think of those novices where they'd be using single words the very beginning weeks of school, to then the sentences, to strings of sentences, to if you were going to describe this house and who lives there, to start telling a story and imagine what that is like or where it's located, etc. Role playing, and just a word of caution about role playing. There's a professor up in Canada who has said that he thinks that language teachers are wonderful for many reasons, but one of them is because instead of crushing imagination, he thinks that language teachers encourage imagination. Because when you think of all the different activities and communication tasks that you do with your students, you're always thinking of, imagine that you're in the market. Imagine you're at the airport. Imagine that you're at a restaurant. Imagine that you're buying food. And so it is always asking the kids to imagine. And that power of imagination with the cultural piece is if you can give them a scene like this, helps their imagination. I haven't been to the Arab world, but now I'm looking at these people and thinking, what might they be saying back and forth? I might be modeling with the class as a teacher and then give them another market scene and see if they can use their imagination to figure out what that conversation could be back and forth. Again, it's scaffolding to get the kids to the point where when they do get to a market, that they know the kinds of things they can say. The caution about role playing, and it's helped by having that visual to look at, is that, again, what we've learned is that if kids don't know anything about the place they have to imagine, you say to them, imagine you're in a market in Marrakesh. Okay. I mean, I wouldn't know what to say. I would just sit there. If I have some visuals to go with it, maybe I watched a video clip in the market, but then after the video clip is done, can I go back to an image and say, we talked about what we saw, we listened, now imagine you're there. What could be going on for that conversation if you're doing that unit about shopping for food or meals or whatever? But helping their imagination grow instead of just telling them, imagine you're in a restaurant along the way. So, collaboration. We talk about the importance of kids working together and the power of why do kids come to school anymore. There's certainly a group of people in the world who say they really don't need to because they can sit in front of their computer and learn everything that they need. I say the reason they come to school is so they can collaborate, so they can work with real live people, they can get better at the language. Certainly it can be supported by technology, and technology can lend itself to collaboration, but I think it's really important that kids learn how to work together. That's that intercultural communicative competence. It starts in our classroom where they learn to work with other kids that they go to school with, but hopefully some of those skills transfer to the real world. So this is Johnson & Johnson from the University of Minnesota did tons of work on how you set up group work. And so there's great research for us to learn from. these are some of the websites that you can use for collaborating with your classrooms around the world. There are millions of them. These are 4 that teachers have used and been successful with. And again, I'll send you the whole PowerPoint so you have that to look at along the way. We're on page 5 in the handout, and those websites are listed at the top of page 5. Again, purposeful. If they're going to work with Skype or they're going to be linking with a classroom in another place, you have to think about that vocabulary. Yes, you want to talk about how food is the same or different, or our housing is the same or different, but there's some basic procedural language that they really need if you want them to stay in the target language. I used to say I have a dream that when I have my students work on a project, they could also use French while they were working on the project and not just in the product they were making, where they spoke English about it all the time and then their product was in French, but they could actually use it as part of the process. That only works if we give them vocabulary that they need in order to be able to stay in the language. And again, it takes a lot of thinking about, what do I want to hear? If we're going to Skype with that classroom, what do I want to hear the kids saying? And I start imagining and start thinking about how we could practice that in a role play before we're actually online with that classroom, kinds of vocabulary that they could use back and forth. This is for a Skype call, and you'll see again the website is on your page 5 in your handout. There's a teacher who has dedicated herself to saying we can use technology for learning and effective learning, and so she's taken lots of different technology tools and said, how do we empower classrooms of kids to use them effectively? This is one that she did about doing a Skype call, and she sets it up telling you what you do to get ready, what you do during the call, even if you have a whole classroom of kids, what are the responsibilities, and what do you do afterwards to help the kids process what they learned through that. And her website is globallyconnectedlearning.com. It's on page 5, about the middle of your handout also for you to look at. And she's got the templates for you to use to fill in. It's more detailed than what I put up here on the screen, but it gives you a way to have courage to say, okay, I'm going to try to do this. And maybe the Skype isn't going to be to another part of the world to begin with. Maybe it's going to be with one of your colleagues. You know, start small and build with what you can do. This is from Dr. Chantal Thompson, who taught at BYU when she developed this. And she said, you know, I cannot get those college students beyond intermediate, low, or mid in their interpersonal. We're just stuck there. No matter what I do, no matter how good they are, it still comes out when I listen as a OPI tester, they come out intermediate, low, mid. So she decided that, you know, she just couldn't blame the kids anymore, that she had to think about it, had to be her teaching. And what she presented at an ACTFL conference was saying that kids, just like we talked about for everything else, they need to practice how to be interpersonal because they're not good at elaborating, at doing more. So on the back side of your, this page that you filled in, you've got this, and we really don't have time to fill it out today, I'm sorry. But what she did was say, this is what you have to do to get the kids to become richer, more sophisticated conversation partners. So she worked with the whole class and said, this is the situation. You're planning a weekend movie marathon with friends. This is what we need to discuss. And she sometimes had the kids figure out what they wanted to talk about. When she started this, she said she told them, this is all the information you need to gather to have this discussion about having a movie marathon. Then The functions to be practiced, she embedded those, said this is the language pieces, expressing likes and dislikes, asking questions, and sequencing were gonna be the three main language functions that they wanted to work on. There are many others, but she wanted to emphasize those three, these kids. Vocabulary needed, you know, you could make the list longer. If it's part of a unit, maybe you just refer them to the unit they've been working on, etc. Expressions to encourage elaboration, to get them to say more. Expressions like before we decide, or afterwards, along with, besides, obviously, especially. You look at those words that are up there, those are the words that we don't often teach because we don't have pictures of them. But yet, that's what's going to get them from that novice, just single sentences, to connected sentences. I always wondered how you did that very well. And part of it is just, again, that darn vocabulary. Are we giving them the words they need to start pulling pieces together? So these are ones that she really wanted them to work on. And then the last category is classroom brainstorming of, after she gave them that situation, she said, what else do you need? If you imagined yourself having this conversation, what are you gonna need? And then she let them practice. And practice, and practice with different partners, how they could do this. And then, what she did for their final assessment was change the task slightly, so that it wasn't go home and memorize this now and present it, but saying, you've had a lot of practice now planning a movie marathon with friends. Now for the final assessment, we want you to have a music marathon, your favorite music or whatever. You know, you always have to think about the language that the kids have some background in or whatever. But giving them a similar situation but not identical, and that's how she then evaluated their ability to speak spontaneously. And at that point, when she gave them the slightly different situation, they didn't get a week to practice. It was her trying to nudge them to that idea of spontaneous, but very similar. Oh, I'm gonna have to ask about, you know, these kinds of things. What you're doing is giving the kids the ideas that are gonna help them talk more. For me, when I tried this, it worked really well. The hardest part for me was to switch it just a little bit so that it was similar but not identical, because I didn't want the kids to go home and memorize. You know, you always have those wonderful students who will go home and memorize what they need because they want that forever A, and so you want to surprise them a little bit. So maybe you put in a little twist, maybe you change the topic a little bit to something else that they've discussed. Maybe it's about a TV show, or maybe it's, you know, whatever it is, so they're using some similar things but not identical. What she did by doing this consistently, practice, scaffolding, pulling it away, was she was able to move them up a sub-level in a semester in college. Something she hadn't been able to do before, because she said basically what she was telling the kids, practice more. But she didn't know, you know, she didn't know how to help them be good conversation partners. And this gave them, oh, I need these kinds of things. So that then, she said that her students then, as they went to another unit, maybe it was travel, I keep using travel as a reference today, they start thinking already about, to have a conversation about travel, what kind of vocabulary am I gonna need? To talk about it, purposeful vocabulary, not just to, you know, say objects or whatever. So I share that with you and say that she is amazing with what she was able to accomplish by just thinking about why her students couldn't bump up, and that we weren't giving them enough support so that they could be spontaneous. They had ideas for what they could say along the way. So, sorry we're out of time today for that. The next ones I'll go through really quickly. We've got a couple minutes here, and this, the other side of talking is listening. So, when you make conversation, you have to listen too, really? Okay, so here are the slides. I love this visual from the Chinese that, you know, an image is worth 1,000 words about how kids need to learn to listen. And you've got these for you in the handout on page 5. Practicing reactions. Wait for the speaker to be done before you ask a clarifying question. The difference between listening and waiting for your turn to speak. Here is that reminder of clarification again. Restating what somebody said. Oh, I heard you say. That research has shown us that that is such a validating way to tell people I'm listening to you, because you repeat back something they said and you're going, oh, well, you were listening to me. If we had time, I would look for those wow reactions. Follow-up questions. Politely challenging, not getting upset with someone and saying you're wrong, but saying, really? Notice when the topic's exhausted, so you can move on. And then this is a guide that you can use to help the students rate themselves or rate somebody else to practice being a good listener. And that is, we just bump ahead here, on page 6. Top of page 6, you've got the same chart. So you could watch and observe and make comments, and kids could work in groups and notice what they did themselves or what their partners did to be good listeners during the conversation practice to get better at the interpersonal mode. Thinking of that interpersonal mode, that conversation, and again, it's all purposeful, it really does link to the interpretive and presentational modes of communication. Interpretive, where they're hearing people, watching video clips, listening to you, that's where they get the models of the really good language. The presentational is where they get a chance to work on it and get correction. I was talking to someone at lunch break saying, my students, sometimes their pronunciation is so bad I don't even understand them. There it is in the presentational mode where they get a chance to think about what they're going to say, practice it, and you can give them feedback on how to make it better. We aren't, you know, we think about that interpersonal has to be spontaneous, etc. We want to encourage the kids along the way. But there is a place where we are very intentional about saying, let's work on this. Let's see if you can say it better, if you can say it more appropriately, you can say it correctly. But that's part of what the whole package is about. And then the interpersonal is live, where you take a step back and say, okay, you've heard lots of really good language on this unit, and we've worked on it, we've done practices with you, with each other, etc., focused, getting feedback along the way, but then ultimately is, can you stand on your feet and use it now? And it might not be as beautiful as what it was when it was coached in the presentational, but it's still good, and it's still a part of what it all is about to get better at language. Mm-hmm.
Can you say something about assessment? Because you mentioned wonderful things, but a question comes in mind, how am I gonna
Assess it?
assess all these wonderful things?
Well,
I know there's no one size fits all, but like if you can put us in some generic way of
well, you'll see a couple things at the end here, and I'm sorry I'm cruising through this so quickly, but I can talk with you afterwards about it a little more, about how that might look, but you might get some ideas here as we keep moving forward here, as we wrap up today. This is what a full unit looks like for us when we think about setting up a template to say, how do I work with these kids? And to your question about the assessment, at the top you see the unit goals, and then underneath it, what we believe now is so important for language is that the assessment be performance, that you're showing me, okay, so now what can you do with this? How can you show me that you understand more of what you read or what you listen to on a video or whatever? How can you show me what you can do in the presentational writing or speaking, where you get a chance to practice and be your very best, because it's not just thinking on your feet? And finally, on the right-hand box, in those 3 boxes on the performance tasks, what can you do interpersonally? And then these are what we call the can-do statements of the pieces that come together to make up those final performance tasks. And then this is getting down to what we call the toolbox then. What language functions will these tasks give you insight into how well the kids are doing? What is the grammar that goes along with those functions? And then finally, priority vocabulary. What are the key vocabulary expressions that they need? That's a whole unit, and that's not what we're here for today, but I wanted to give you the idea of how that interpersonal fits in, because interpersonal is all about purposeful use of language to accomplish these unit goals. So, here was a task, it was about biodiversity, and imagine that you want the kids to make videos about biodiversity locally and in the French-speaking world. After they brainstorm, they come to agreement on what to include in the video to compare biodiversity locally to the French-speaking world. So that was the whole unit we were doing, and now they're gonna work in small groups and create this video about what they learned, and everybody learns something a little bit different as they go. These questions come from what we call high leverage teaching practices, HLTP, and they're reflective questions to think about as you set up a task to say, ooh, this is a good interpersonal task for the kids to do. These are some questions to think about, to ask yourself after you design the task. First one's the most important. With the task you have there, do the kids need to listen to their partners in order to complete the task? Is it truly a group process, or is it just language back and forth and they really could do it all on their own? That's a tough one, to be honest with yourself and go, oh yeah, okay, they do need each other, because they're bringing in different information, not all bringing in templated same. Is a task engaging? Were you motivated to listen to your partner? We hope that we've picked things that are interesting, that make them know, oh, what did you learn? You went and explored what the efforts are in Paris, and you went and explored what the efforts are in Nice. Are they the same or different? Because we're putting together this mix of what the French do for biodiversity. Does the task promote negotiation of meaning or conversational adjustments? Does it require cultural knowledge? We hope that's that intercultural, that it's not just biodiversity, and it could have been from the United States, but it's really thinking about how do the French look at it? It's part of their constitution. Wow, think about that. Does the task require the use of vocabulary and grammar structures that were in the planning template? Do they need to use? Did you pick good words for them to have? And is the grammar that they learned something that they could apply to that task that they do? This is what high leverage teaching practices tell us will make you have a really good interpersonal task. And so on the sheet that was here, you can go home and see if you could fill that in for a task that you wanted the kids to do, and look at these questions and see if you can answer them and smile. Assessment, formative assessments to help with interpersonal, and I'll just flip through these and highlight a couple things along the way. This is pages 7 and 8, the last pages in your handout. Coming up here. This is the classic talk score. If you just want to get a read on if the kids are staying in the target language when you're having these different activities that they're doing, you you can put your student's name down the side and just give a plus, check, or minus. Are they using the target language as you're cruising around listening? Accurate, be gentle. Comprehensible would be better, except that it doesn't spell out the word talk. So that's why it doesn't say comprehensible there. They're listening, that they're not on their cell phones. They're not trying to finish their math assignment, but they're really listening, making eye contact with each other, and they're kind. Helping each other. When somebody can't think of a word, that they're ready to jump in and help. And it's a really good kind of daily assessment that the kids can do for themselves, that they could do for their group, that you can do as a quick check-in to see how the kids are doing. This is another one that focuses on negotiation and meaning, and it's the same way as the one before, but look at what you're listening for. Are you hearing the kids ask questions? Are you hearing responses from the students? Or silence? Someone's asking all the questions but then never answering any of them. Reactions, after somebody responds, do you hear the kids reacting like, oh, that's interesting, or tell me more, whatever. And then general, again, gentle accuracy, is it comprehensible what they're doing? And again, it's just a formative, just a way to make them accountable in a gentle way to say, this is what you have to be doing if you're gonna get better at interpersonal. This is a scoring guide, again, another variation on the theme. We found that another one of the reasons that kids didn't get better at some of these things is because they didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. Oh, I'm supposed to propose an idea. Oh, I never thought of that. Add new information, react to other ideas, etc. If you can do these things, yes, that's what it's all about. This is a participation one. Again, a way to help the kids think about, how do I do a good job being part of this group that's discussing the topic or whatever. And you can see that over here on the left, you hope they're not spending time there, but they're moving over towards the right. You could give them a scale of 1 to 5 on how well they're doing, or they could rate themselves. How well am I doing at that? You have to give all those categories. Maybe you only want to talk about 2 or 3 that you want them to work on. So they're really focused on getting better, because it's a scaffolded activity that leads to that spontaneous interpersonal. But first they have to learn how to do it. And so they need to practice so that they can get out there and play on the field of real interactions. It's another one on comprehensibility. We don't, sometimes people say, well, ACTFL doesn't care about this anymore. They really do. They're just saying it's not where you start, middle, and end. It's a piece of it. And sometimes you really want the kids to think very carefully, am I saying this correctly? Am I getting better at that? And so again, you could move from difficult to understand the accent to being understood by classmates and teacher. One of the things you're seeing more and more in the literature now is saying that you don't have to have a perfect native speaker accent. You have to have a comprehensible accent. And so, that used to be like native speaker would be the goal. No, comprehensible is the goal. And how that part of that is trying to imitate that native speaker, but you don't have to be a carbon copy as long as you're comprehensible. So, and then this is a rubric with a little more description of what the kids would be evaluated on that you could use for that task for a novice learner. Here, the thinking about how well do I understand? Can you follow the conversation? How do I participate? And what do I use to stay in the target language? And then this is a little more detailed one. Again, on performance, if you had them working in pairs or small groups, and this was your final assessment. These are some things that you might consider. And notice that the categories there are in the forms of questions, so that when you give kids this rubric, as you're working through the units, they can think about those questions. And you could just even pull out those questions. It's good to give them the descriptors so they know what that looks like. But just thinking all the time about those questions, how well am I understood? Am I really trying to speak clearly, to be understood, etc.? And so it goes. And there I am. I love this quote. And that's why I work with teachers. We're stronger when we listen, and we're smarter when we share. And that's what keeps your language communities growing, is because you're an incredible group of sharers, I think. So thank you
And
for...
this is your picture.
Thank you for listening today. Had a little more listening than I had hoped for, but that's okay. And I'll stay if you have questions afterwards, and I'll send you the copies of the PowerPoint and also the descriptors for the novice and intermediate. And if you have other things that you need, feel free to ask, and I'm happy